All right. Welcome, everyone. I was so happy to see people talking to the people next to them, supporting an independent bookstore and queer author already. Hi, we have somebody else here too. So, my name is Sarah Prager. I use she, her pronouns, and I live nearby in Amherst. And I'm the author of 4 books about LGBTQIA+ history. And I am here to share some of those stories with you. I want to talk a little bit about the history of why we celebrate Pride Month in June, why we're all here, maybe. And I want to hear what you already know about queer history, and then make sure that everybody leaves learning something new. Because even if you've heard of Harvey Milk and Sylvia Rivera, we're going to talk about some very little known people from queer history too. And I do use queer as an umbrella term for pretty much anybody not completely straight or completely cisgender, which means not transgender, by the definitions of their time and culture and place, or our time and culture and place, could really be anything, because the LGBTQI and A are all pretty recent words looking at at human history, but that does not mean that gender fluidity and queerness in general are new. So, I live with my spouse. We have an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old. Daniel in the unicorn horn graduated kindergarten this week. And Eleanor is a rising 3rd grader. She's gonna be in 3rd. And Aspen's my spouse. And they use they, them pronouns, and Daniel uses he, him, and Eleanor uses she, her. And this was our wedding last year in Amherst. And I grew up in Connecticut. I came out when I was 14 and started teaching myself queer history as a way to get to know my community, but ultimately myself. I felt really seen when I read a letter or biography or diary or anything of another queer woman hundreds of years ago feeling the same way, and it was so empowering. It helped me to understand that I wasn't alone, the first person to ever feel this way. It helped me feel less isolated and to have a sense of community, even with these people that I had never met, when I didn't know as many queer people in person. So I started sharing queer history through a mobile app called Quist, which is now pretty buggy, never got enough funding to keep up with all the required security updates. But that app, the work with that, was successful enough that I got on the radar of HarperCollins, and my first book, Queer There and Everywhere, came out in 2017, and this black cover is the 2023 second edition, which is revised and expanded. And that is a young adult book, so it's written for teens, but it really just means it's a conversational tone that is very accessible for adults too. Rainbow Revolutionaries and A Child's Introduction to Pride are both middle grade books, and Kind Like Marcia is a picture book for elementary school kids. All of these I wrote for my own kids to have ways to get to know our ancestors, for, of course, just the youth growing up like me, because there weren't any books making all of this into teen language when I was a teen. And because I think queer youth deserve to know that queer people are a part of history, but also I think it's really important that non-queer youth know that queer people are a part of history and are heroes and leaders and inspirational and everywhere, or all the different things that the books say we are. And that's what I want to share with you too. Now, yes, these books are banned in multiple states and school districts and libraries. This is an issue that is not the focus. I'm just mentioning it here, and then we're moving on, but I think it's important we remember the context, that the history we're learning is actively being suppressed, and that's part of my work and part of why we all need to share what we learn with each other and with others. It's not taught in schools. Sometimes it's not allowed to. Queer people aren't usually born into queer families, so we really need to teach it to each other. So I encourage you to think about what tidbits you're going to pick up to share with others. So, like I said, we'll be doing kind of a global look at queer history, and I'm gonna make sure that we learn about some specific individuals who I think were really interesting from what we can tell. And of course, we'll have time for Q&A. If you have questions as I go, feel free to ask. If I say hold that for the end or I'm going to get to that, then we'll do that. But I don't want you to forget it. It's fine. That's what I would do. So when I say queer history, what do you think of?
Civil rights activists.
Mm-hmm. Specific activists?
Yeah, specific activists. Stonewall.
Mm-hmm. Okay. A lot of times people do say Stonewall. Have people here heard of Stonewall? Everyone, yes? No, okay. All right, another nope? Okay.
No, that was a
So, all right. So for those who do know what we mean when we say Stonewall, what was/is Stonewall?
It's both a place and a moment.
Yeah.
So the place, it was a gay bar.
It is still.
Right?
It is still.
It's a gay bar in the West Village,
Mm-hmm.
I want to say, and it was a place where there's a children's book for trans teens that met someone there that were protected and, oh yes, please come in. Excellent. So it was a place where people felt really comfortable, but then it was also a place that got raided and there was protests against the violence of that raid.
Right.
Can I pick up from there?
No, I just wanted to see who was talking.
And it became sort of like a moment and a rallying cry.
Mm-hmm.
Of,
That protest. That protest that happened there.
yes.
Mm-hmm.
And it brought courage and anger, useful anger, to the movement. I'm pretty sure there was already anger.
Yeah. That's amazing. Thank you. Does anyone want to add to that? Yeah.
Well, I just remember, I know this may not apply, but I know that there's a British scholar, and he developed the computer for the first time.
Yeah.
He helped end the war sooner, and he was
Yeah.
gay.
Yeah, Alan Turing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
His name. And he was made to do these horrible things to try to get rid of
Yeah.
who he was.
Yeah.
It ruined everything for him.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Has anyone seen The Imitation Game, that movie about Alan Turing? It's based closely on the definitive biography out there, which I haven't done original research on him, but I read that biography and the movie followed it closely, so I think it's pretty accurate based on that. The movie is called The Imitation Game. It's about Alan Turing, who basically invented the first computer during World War II, and yeah, exactly like they said. It's exactly like they said. But after, in the 50s, he was convicted of homosexuality, and gross indecency there have been many different crimes, and he was given a choice between 2 years in prison or basically forced hormone therapy to cure him of his homosexuality, just like you said. And he didn't want to go to jail so that he could continue his work. But as a criminal, he lost his security clearance and was not able to continue his work anyway. And he only survived a couple of years after the treatment began. And honestly, it's really an example of what homophobia costs the whole world, not just gay people, because you think about how much else. He was so young that if he had already invented the computer and was working in this field, how much further he would have brought things for all of humanity with that kind of mind. And so many others who are brilliant like him are when you don't bring everyone to the table and make everyone feel included, or at least don't criminalize their capacity to be there. It harms everybody. So
He was one of the chief code breakers during World War II. I mean, he probably saved England.
Yeah. It's estimated that he saved many thousands of lives and shortened the war by like 2 years or something. It's hard to calculate, but yeah. Does anyone have anything else on Stonewall? Does anyone know when this protest happened?
1969.
That's right. And
I was in high school at that time.
yeah,
But I remember taking the train in from Long Island and going to the village, and we went over to Stonewall to sort of like look at it. But it was really, a scary, rundown, mafia-owned.
yeah.
It wasn't,
Yeah, so it's like
It was scary, it was.
in some ways, those scary places were kind of the only places you could go for community. So you're saying it's a place where you could go to feel safe, and it's like, well, it is in the sense that you're among other queer people, visibly, maybe the only place that you can, and it's run by the mob because it is a criminal establishment, because queerness is illegal. It's illegal to serve alcohol to a homosexual. So right off the bat, this bar is a criminal organization or a business. And cross-dressing was a major way that queerness was criminalized. And so, yeah, the relationship between these bars, including the Stonewall Inn, and the police is complicated, where they're being bribed to turn a blind eye, and they are still raiding regularly. And multiple times a week, police would come in and flip on the lights, the jukebox goes off, you're wearing a dress, you have an M on your license, and you go to jail. And you're dancing with someone of the same sex, you're going to jail. And since there are no anti-discrimination protections, you legally can then be fired, lose your housing, etc., over this public arrest record. So, does anyone know what month in 1969 the Stonewall Uprising happened? It was June. So that's why Pride Month is in June. The first march was on the 1-year anniversary of the beginning of the riots. And, I think we've said, like, what happened at this moment was people refusing to be arrested and fighting back against the police oppression. And it turned into a multi-day rebellion. And it is still an operating bar today, and there is a National Park Service visitor center next to it with all kinds of historical interpretation materials. I just got to go to that visitor center for the first time last month, and it's made to make you cry, and it worked.
I have a question about that. So
Yeah.
information is not being lost.
So I talked with the park rangers there. So it made the news that the website that the government has removed trans and queer from LGBTQ on the Stonewall website it's the first nationally designated historic site by the National Park Service having to do with queer history. That happened under President Obama. And then this erasure happened, but it was just on the website. The park rangers working there have not needed to censor or have not censored any trans inclusion, et cetera, at the government-run visitor center. So I was heartened and somewhat surprised to hear that. But yeah, so let's see. This was a turning point in the movement. The first organizations and riots and protests and picket lines had happened throughout the 50s and 60s. June 1969 was this tipping point where this riot just was different and grew. And all of this organizing happened the summer after, inspired by it. And people were feeling like, what if we did fight back? What if we changed this? And in kind of in critical mass, right? This is one of the only actual photographs of the riot that exists. Okay, now how much further back before 1969 does queer history go?
One of my favorite photos is that photo.
Yeah, okay, well, that's over 2,000 years, but you want to say all the way back? I'll go with that answer. Okay, so sometimes people think of like, well, maybe the Greeks or that kind of thing, but it really is all of human history. How can we actually say forever, all the way back? How do we know before the written word? So, I mean, the same with any kind of historical research. Beyond, so much of queer history is erased from the written record, because if you wrote it down, you could be in very serious danger. Queerness is criminalized for most of Western human history, just for centuries. And so all of those stories were less likely to be written down, except for arrest records, execution records, and that kind of thing. You weren't gonna put this in your diary if you didn't desperately need to get this out. Those letters, those love letters between two men could be fatal. So beyond the written word, we have, these are some of the earliest representations of queerness, where around the pre-colonial world especially, the indigenous religions often would have deities who were presenting as half male and half female, or all genders in one, or two sexes in one person. And this was, it's seen across all 6 inhabited continents. And the origin story of the world, of there's one person who splits into male and female and creates the world. Or it's also very tied to spirituality, because healers and spiritual leaders would often be under what we would call today the trans umbrella, because you needed to be able to leave behind everything about to ascend to the spiritual plane, you would need to leave gender behind, and all binaries like alive and dead and male and female. You had to be the kind of person who could rise above those things. So being outside of a gender binary was very holy and special and revered in many cultures. And in over 100 different Native American nations, there are, do we know the term two-spirit? So that's a modern term, is coined in 1990, and two-spirit comes from one of these different nations' terms for male and female spirit in one person. But in North America and around the world, there would be 2 genders, 3 genders, 4 genders, 5 genders, etc., as the norm in that culture. And some people wouldn't even consider it queer history, because it was natural. You weren't trans and that was other. It was just there were just 4 different genders, and just as normal as 2 genders are to mainstream Western culture today. So this person, we only know the name that their enslavers gave them, so we don't actually know their name, but Francisco Manicongo was taken from the Congo area to Brazil as an enslaved person in the 1500s. They were one of those 3rd genders in their community, and they refused to stop wearing the traditional clothing that designated them as that specific gender and from their culture. And they were put on trial in Brazil for that, as well as for sodomy. And that record is the only way we know about this individual person. We're not even sure what happened to them. But it's just one example of how many stories we don't even know, because an enslaved person have their individual human story written as if they were an individual human with dignity, not their language extinct, not allowed to learn to read or write in Portuguese, etc. The suppression of these stories is immense, but ones still do come through. And this map here shows the way these are countries that criminalize same-sex sex today, and the colors are increasing of the number of years in prison up to the death penalty. For over half of the countries that criminalize same-sex sex, it is because that law was originally brought when they were a British colony. And when the country gains independence, the laws stay the same. And if they don't update them, then they stay. This is a main influence of colonialism when it comes to sex and gender. The idea that there are only 2 genders, these are the only ones, they have to align with your physical sex. The idea that sex is for procreation, it has to be within marriage, it has to only be between a man and a woman. All of these things were Christian European ideals that not everywhere in the world believed were the ideals. And colonialism is what made that the mainstream de facto. Other places, bisexuality was the norm instead of heterosexuality being the norm. There were same-sex marriages, all kinds of things, and the gender fluidity that we talked about. So
that's still relevant, like to this day?
yeah, that's a 2023 map. Okay, any questions? So these are going to be some spreads from my book, A Child's Introduction to Pride. And I just want to show some of the breadth of queer history. So I mentioned Alan Turing contributing to the world. These are some of the other things that queer people have given to the world. In literature, now this is a book for kids, so I tried to put kids' books. Goodnight Moon by Margaret Wise Brown, Where the Wild Things Are by Maurice Sendak, both queer authors, and I just love to think that we had these queer voices like in our lives, our whole lives, without even knowing them.
Were they identified as queer?
Yeah, so Maurice Sendak came out.
He was older, right?
Yeah, exactly. He had been with his male partner for 50 years, and he didn't want to come out to his parents. And after they died, when I'm not, how old was he? 1928 to 2012 is his life. He did a New York Times interview, I think, and shared this partner who had been a secret his whole life. Margaret Wise Brown was, I don't know that she ever would have chosen any identity term, but her romantic history is bi. So I have Lorraine Hansberry here. She was a lesbian, and she was the first Black playwright to have a show performed on Broadway, or I'm sorry, first Black woman to have a play performed on Broadway. That was A Raisin in the Sun. And I have many other folks up here. Virginia Woolf, Gertrude Stein, Oscar Wilde, Walt Whitman, and we will talk about Emily Dickinson since she lived around the corner. In music, of course, Broadway would not exist without queer people's contributions. But also, Catherine Lee Bates, also who lived in Massachusetts, was a professor at Wellesley. And she and her partner, who was also a Wellesley professor, they were called the Catherines. They were both named Catherine. And they lived together. And Catherine Lee Bates's poem, America the Beautiful, the poem became the lyrics for a song that someone else composed. So, she wrote, the poem was called America. So the lyrics to America the Beautiful are from her. I have Switched on Bach, which this trans woman, Wendy Carlos, won a, what was it? Is it an Emmy? No, it's a Grammy. Grammy is music, right? So she won Grammys for her work in creating synthesized classical music and invented an entire instrument and was pairing it with computers in a time before that was done much. But she also composed the scores to A Clockwork Orange and The Shining. And then, I mean, how many music stars can you fit? I have like Elton John and Melissa Etheridge, but it's like so many. The arts, always a kind of safe haven for queer people who maybe couldn't have an office job, but might, fit in among the other cultural outcasts in the Moulin Rouge or something. The arts, just like all of these, could go on. Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo both faced sodomy charges. it's impossible to really say that those weren't unfounded accusations, for example. But there's more beyond those when you look, and it is always up to a historian's interpretation how to consider all the evidence and ultimately make guesses, because especially around these things of identifying with the word bisexual or something when that word did not exist. So just like these other cultures might have had 5 genders as their norm, some of Florence had bisexuality as more of a norm, and it can be complicated, but I think that they all fall under this very broad term of queer. Let's see. And then the sciences, we've already mentioned Alan Turing, but I have a trans satellite radio here because Martine Rothblatt founded Sirius Radio, and the first non-geostationary satellite-to-car broadcasting system. And she's trans, and she and her wife are like pioneers in robotics and are trying to like download brain, like your consciousness so that you can live on. And then also their daughter had a very rare disease, and since she's one of the highest paid female CEOs in the world, they invested it to like cure this rare disease. And that's one of the many living people included in here. Sally Ride came out in her obituary, or gave permission about 10 days before her death to her partner, for her partner to be mentioned in her obituary. Tam. Yeah, so it's a lot. Like, there is so much queer history. I want to share those individual stories now. Do you have any questions here before we do the individual stories? Okay. Has anyone heard of Christina of Sweden? We have a yes. That's wonderful. So Christina of Sweden was Queen of Sweden. To be Queen of Sweden, you needed to marry a man and have a child. If it was just not possible to not do those requirements. And everyone, meaning the parliament, kept saying, you'll find the right guy. And Christine was like, I promise you I will not. Literally said, I would rather choose death than a man. And so they gave up being queen because they were like, I'm not going to do this. So they first negotiated a salary for life and servants and land and all of this stuff is in an exit deal, and then put on masculine clothing, rode on a horse to Rome, lived out the rest of their life happily on the Mediterranean there, and dressed in male and female clothing and dated men and women, and died of old age and was buried in the Vatican. So Greta Garbo also played them in a movie in the 1930s, and you should really just look up some of the clips on YouTube, because Garbo, who is also in Queer There and Everywhere, makes an appearance in another chapter, who is also from Sweden, is in this masculine clothing, kisses a woman on the lips because the Hays Code for censorship had not come into effect yet. And the advisor says to Christina in the film, but Your Majesty, you cannot die an old maid. And Greta says, I have no intention of doing that. I will die bachelor. And I have this assigned female at birth after a few minutes, because the midwife first announced that a prince had been born and then corrected herself a few minutes later, said it's a princess, and said the baby was so hairy and so loud that I just thought it was a boy. But it's very possible Christina was intersex. If there's confusion over, if they had ambiguous genitalia, then they were actually, their body was exhumed in, I think, the 70s from the Vatican to try to see if they were intersex, which you can't really do from bones, but they were possibly intersex. They were certainly gender nonconforming or gender fluid in some ways, whether they were a masculine presenting woman, a trans man, non-binary, gender fluid, etc. There's no way to know, but they're one of my favorite people in queer history because so many of those groups can see themselves reflected in this person. As long as you say, no, don't say she was a lesbian and nobody else can ever, this is lesbian history only, or any other way of saying this is not, can't also be yours. I think it's awesome because they were also very possibly asexual. And I think today's terms, probably non-binary, biromantic, asexual. But that's completely impossible. But if. Now, at the same time, on the other side of the ocean, over here in the Americas, Juan Inés de la Cruz was in New Spain, a colony, Mexico, before its independence from Spain. Now, born into poverty in New Spain, you could not just get away with being an eccentric royal. Even as a peasant in Sweden, you can't just be like, I'm going to wear pants even though it's against the law. Christina could get away with that. That's privilege. And Juana could not. Juana also was going to be forced to marry a man because women were not allowed to get an education or get a job in her time and place. I'm sorry, I found this fidget and it makes some noise sometimes, but so you needed to get a husband to provide you with food and shelter because he could get a job and you couldn't. Juana asked her mom if she could dress as a boy to get to go to school. She really wanted to get to learn and knew of Christina, who was famed as the most educated woman in the world of their time. So Juana used an option that a lot of women who didn't want to marry men did, which was to become a nun. And you could spend all your time with other women who don't want to spend time with men either, and have food and shelter that way. So Juana is one of many examples of queer nuns throughout centuries of history that we have documented. So for her, she ended up becoming just about the most educated woman in Mexico, at least, and dedicated all her time to learning in between her 5 daily prayers. And I think I've got here one of her lines of poetry, which was often directed towards the vice queen of New Spain, so the viceroy's wife, kind of the president of the colony. She is considered one of the most prolific poets of the Spanish language and is on Mexican currency today, is such an acclaimed poet. And that poetry was definitely queer. Okay, Now, our hometown hero, Emily Dickinson, has anyone been to her museum, for example? So she, it has been shown by infrared technology in the 90s that many of her poems were dedicated to her sister-in-law, Susan Gilbert, and they were erased before they were allowed to be published with those dedications. MHC Mount Holyoke is where she's an alum of, and yeah, another poet writing about women like Sappho and Juana and so many others. Now, Ellen L. Hart is hopefully someone people have not heard of. Great, yeah? Got you on one. Alan was the first trans man that we have in recorded history to receive a gender-affirming surgery in the US. He was a doctor, and during medical school, he had access to many other doctors. And so his professor ended up being able to help him out and give him a surgery that he asked for, that maybe his own primary care physician would not have referred him for. So that was a hysterectomy in 1918. And so he transitioned during medical school. So he went in with one name, came out with the name Alan, and in presentation as well. This created a problem in his career because he would keep being outed at jobs and being fired for being trans, because they'd say, didn't somebody know you with a different name at the medical school that we both went to, or something like that. Or synthetic testosterone, injectable gel, had not been invented yet, didn't exist. So he was also just not passing without facial hair, etc., or a deepened voice. So it wasn't until that medical advance happened to be able to take testosterone that he was then he was a writer as a part-time job in between being a doctor to supplement his income, because we all become writers for the doctor's salary to be something stable in between other jobs. So X-ray didn't even exist when he was born. And but he figured out how to use X-ray to detect tuberculosis in the lungs early enough so that you could treat the person early enough to save their life. And TB was the leading cause of death in the US at the time. So this was a really big deal. It was after he was able to get access to physical transition that he was able to go on a speaking tour more safely and tell other doctors, you didn't just put this up online in your PDF of your study. So he went on a speaking tour only after he was able to deepen his voice and these kinds of things for his own professional and personal safety. And it's another example, transphobia harmed us all in that way by not getting that out more. Yeah?
When did like injectable hormones and stuff like that actually come to light? Like, how
It's my
was able to do those things?
It's my understanding the 1940s. And then, is this the last person? Yeah, this is. Okay, so get your Q&A ready. Bayard Rustin, who maybe folks have, some have. I don't know why I'm quizzing you on if you have or haven't. The point is that we're all gonna learn a little more about them, whether we ever heard of them before or not. I'm just curious, because I wanna make them people that many have never heard of. So Bayard Rustin was really a right-hand man to Martin Luther King Jr. and was a key leader of the civil rights movement in the US. He was a lead organizer of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where the I Have a Dream speech was delivered, and he was the one who delivered the demands of the march at. He's right there in the video by Dr. King. However, he could never be in Dr. King's role. He couldn't be the front-facing representative of the movement because of his queerness. He was arrested many times for as a pacifist, as what's the resistance, nonviolent resistance, choosing to get arrested, sitting on the front of the bus in the 40s and 50s before Rosa Parks in the 60s, and as a freedom rider. So this arrest in 1953 was for homosexuality, and he served time for that in California. And he was fired from his job in the movement. It wasn't a look that they could present to make the movement look bad. And he made his way, but it took him years, but he made his way back to at least be a behind-the-scenes organizer. But he convinced the NAACP, Dr. King, et cetera. He was a major part in convincing them to use nonviolence as the primary tactic of the movement. He studied nonviolence in India and brought it back and, told Dr. King, you can't have armed guards at your home protecting your children. We have to be completely nonviolent. And he was kind of the biggest proponent of that. And he he was an activist for queer rights later in his life. He lived with his partner, Walter, in New York City, and Walter accepted a posthumous Presidential Medal of Freedom on Bayard's behalf from President Obama. So, we're in every movement and every community. So, the feedback one is not working. I tested it before. Go to sarahprager.com in general. Ignore the /feedback. I'm putting up a new little form where you can, but I don't know. That link's not there yet. But follow me on Instagram, and my books that share stories like these are here, and I am happy to personalize any signings, and I'm happy to take your questions now. Thank you, and happy Pride.
So you live in Amherst?
I do.
Are your books at the local schools?
Yeah, I've actually gone and read, kind of like Marcia, to my kids' classes. And yeah, they're not banned from local libraries or schools. Mm-hmm.
Or in your local library.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's your next book?
Oh, I have about 5 book proposals out, and nothing has gotten picked up. I've been trying for a couple years, and I don't want to blame the book bans and everything, but it is different out there, I would say. But I have ideas for picture book, middle grade, YA, and adult. So I'm around. You let me know.
Well, I thank you for doing this because it's interesting when I look back, the books for that age reading level, not only did they not look as vibrant as those covers do, and the inside illustrations and the messages and everything, but they just weren't there, like it was a presentation of heterosexuality,
Yeah.
starting with Dick and Jane, just, there was no even thought, and you made a comment earlier about how queer people aren't necessarily raised by queer parents.
Yeah.
And I think, that's where we're seeing this change, and that's why I think I'm like, it was out there now, and there's a lot to choose from now. online presence? How have you negotiated that, navigated that with your books?
Well, it's really, honestly, I was nervous about becoming more of a public figure as an author with my first book in 2017, but I was not getting hateful comments, protesters, all of that kind of stuff that was in the back of my mind as a worry. When the book banning movement started in 2021, I stopped using Twitter around that time while it was still Twitter, and especially the pedophile and groomer lines of attack are really common comments and still direct messages anywhere now. 1-star reviews is a way that people can get at you in modern times. And so it does take a toll. But, all the queer authors are in it together. There's a Supreme Court case the announcement will come out any day, sometime by the end of this month, it's about, I think, 7 specific books, and those authors of queer children's books, and whether or not you have to let parents opt out of those books being taught. And those authors have gotten with more attention and publicity about your book, the more it's always kind of a double-edged sword of the same with, they'll get banned more the more popular they are. So being on the radar can definitely mean more online harassment. Mm-hmm.
I know that I was definitely surprised with a lot of the information because I graduated 10 years ago at this point,
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't know hardly any of it.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's crazy how much going through school and everything else where they teach you about these people, but they don't teach you everything that there is to know.
Yeah, Abraham Lincoln and Eleanor Roosevelt are 2 of the 27 people in Queer There and Everywhere, and I think most people are surprised. But you know what? That's kind of the thing about Queer There and Everywhere is we don't usually learn a lot about the personal lives of historical figures to begin with. We could name George Washington's and Abraham Lincoln's wives' names. We know that some parts of their personal lives like that, but to look at someone as a human, I call them Abraham, not Lincoln. Everyone is a first name in the book, and what were their crushes, their issues with self-esteem, their mental health, their issues as teenagers, what were their love lives like, just everything about them as a human. And I think it's I think it's great for students to get to know historical figures, because when you realize, someone who went on to, organize the March on Washington, also had personal struggles or a dating life and just everything else that you can also grow up to do things like that. And I think it's good to personalize and humanize these names that are just names, because they were all people. Yes?
How do you go about researching? Or do you have any strategies or ways that you go about researching when, as you mentioned, there's a lot of censorship?
Yeah.
And, things are interpreted through the story, and so how do you go about that?
Yeah, honestly, speaking of Abraham Lincoln, a lot of the research I actually do through public libraries, where you can request anything, an interlibrary loan, and get biographies and books about the time period and all these different things for the background. And the publication of, I read Eleanor Roosevelt's letters with Lorena Hickok, they were published in a book, and I got that book at the public library. So thank you to Hadley Public Library and all public libraries. But the only stuff I could find about queerness and Abraham Lincoln through those sources they mentioned like a little sentence. One even said there are rumors, like some historians are trying to say that he had some queerness, but he achieved great things, so that's not possible. That was literally at the collection in my town at the time. So going sometimes to queer sources where people might be looked at more broadly instead of assumed definitely straight, unless you have a great burden of proof to prove otherwise, instead of coming at it from a neutral place of like, let's look at the person's whole life without first assuming that they're definitely straight. So there are queer history books, those help. Queer archives, especially ones that have digitized their records, so you don't need to travel. And for some of these people, I got to interview them and over Zoom and stuff, because some of them are still alive. And are still making history now. So those are some of the ways. But I do have sarahprager.com/resources does work, and that is where I have a link to almost 400 queer history books and some podcasts that I recommend and different ways to learn queer history, including like a curricula for K through 12 and stuff like that. Other people's work. I will be around for more questions. Thank you so much for your time.